The snow fell in relentless sheets across the mountain pass, each flake a tiny blade against Sandra Anderson's face as she stumbled through the drifts. Her threadbare coat offered little protection against the wind that howled through the pine trees like the voices of the damned. Behind her, somewhere in the white void, she could hear them calling her name, not with concern, but with the cruel laughter of those who had cast her out into this wilderness to die. Her feet, wrapped in cloth that had long since soaked through, left crimson prints in the pristine snow. Each step sent fire shooting up her legs, but she pressed on because stopping meant death. The bruises on her face throbbed with each gust of wind, purple and black, reminders of the beating that had preceded her exile. They had called her worthless, a burden, a mouth they could no longer afford to feed. The irony was not lost on her that she had begged them to let her work, to earn her keep, only to be told she was too broken, too damaged to be of any use. The cabin appeared through the storm like a mirage, its windows glowing with warm yellow light that seemed impossible in this frozen hell. Smoke rose from its chimney in a steady column, defying the wind that sought to tear it apart. Sandra's knees buckled as she saw it, hope and desperation warring in her chest. She had heard the stories about the man who lived alone in these mountains, the one they called Adam Gonzalez. Some said he was a hermit, others claimed he was dangerous. All agreed he wanted nothing to do with the world below. She collapsed against his door, her fists too numb to knock properly. The sound she made was barely audible over the storm, but somehow it was enough. The door opened, and she found herself looking up at a man whose presence filled the doorway like a mountain itself. Tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair touched by premature gray, and eyes the color of storm clouds. He stared down at her with an expression she could not read. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "Just let me work. I can earn my keep. I won't be trouble. Please." Adam Gonzalez said nothing for a long moment, his gaze taking in her battered face, her torn clothing, the blood in the snow at her feet. When he finally spoke, his voice was deep and rough from disuse. "You're dying." It was not a question, but a statement of fact, delivered without emotion. Sandra tried to shake her head, to protest that she was strong enough to work, but the world tilted dangerously around her. The last thing she saw before darkness claimed her was his weathered hand reaching down toward her. Before we see how this ends, tell us where you're watching from and hype this video in the comments. When consciousness returned, Sandra found herself wrapped in blankets beside a crackling fire. The warmth was so intense after the bitter cold that it felt like being reborn. She tried to sit up, but her body protested with a symphony of aches and pains that reminded her of every blow she had endured. The cabin was larger than it had appeared from outside, with rough-hewn walls and simple but well-made furniture. Everything spoke of a man who lived deliberately, who wasted nothing and valued function over form. Adam Gonzalez sat in a chair across from her, whittling a piece of wood with practiced precision. He had not changed clothes, still wearing the same wool shirt and leather vest she remembered from the doorway. His hands, she noticed, were scarred but steady, the hands of a man who had worked hard all his life and was comfortable with both creation and destruction. He said without looking up from his carving, "What barter for?" Sandra's hand went instinctively to her throat, which felt raw and dry. As if reading her thoughts, he nodded toward a cup of water on the small table beside her makeshift bed. She drank gratefully, the cool liquid soothing the fire in her throat. "I can work," she said as soon as she could speak. "I know I don't look like much now, but I'm stronger than I appear. I can cook, clean, tend animals. I've done it all before. Just give me a chance to prove myself." Adam's knife paused in its work. Quote 7. The question was asked quietly, but Sandra heard the steel beneath the words. She touched her cheek self-consciously, feeling the tender flesh where the bruises were beginning to fade from black to purple to yellow. Again, it was not a question. Quote 10. Sandra's jaw tightened. She had not come here to be pitied or to relive the humiliation of her rejection. "I told you it doesn't matter. I just need work. I can pay my way." Adam set down his knife and looked at her directly for the first time since she had awakened. His eyes were not unkind, but they were penetrating in a way that made her feel exposed. "You think you are the first person to come to my door begging for shelter?" The words stung, but Sandra lifted her chin defiantly. "I'm not begging for shelter. I'm offering to work for it." And what happens when winter ends? When the pass is clear and you can go back down the mountain? His voice held no judgment, only curiosity. You think they'll welcome you back? You think anything will have changed? Sandra had no answer for that because she had not allowed herself to think that far ahead. Survival had consumed all her energy, all her planning. The future was a luxury she could not afford. I don't know, she admitted, but I'll face that when it comes. Right now, I just need to survive until spring. Adam nodded slowly as if her honesty pleased him. I don't need help with the cooking or cleaning. I've been taking care of myself for 15 years. I don't have animals that need tending, just the horse, and she's particular about who handles her. Sandra's heart sank. She had been so certain that her willingness to work would be enough, that any man living alone would welcome an extra pair of hands. Quote, "Mante, quote, Mo." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from the fire. Sandra stared at him, certain she had misheard. Quote, "Santo, quote, Mo." Adam's expression had not changed. His voice remained a level and matter of fact. I'm 34 years old. I've been alone on this mountain long enough. Winter gets lonely and spring brings its own challenges. A man needs a partner, someone to share the burden. Sandra's mind reeled. Quote 24. Quote 20. He picked up his knife and resumed his carving. Quote 26. Quote 27. Sandra's voice rose in pitch. How many wives have you had? None, but I've considered the matter before. Adam's tone remained infuriatingly calm. Quote 30. Sandra struggled to process what he was saying. Quote 31. Quote 32. The fire crackled in the silence that followed. Sandra stared into the flames, trying to understand how her life had taken such an unexpected turn. 3 days ago, she had been begging for scraps, enduring beatings, sleeping in a barn. Now a man she had never met was proposing marriage as casually as he might discuss the weather. "Verdart," she asked finally, "Kotenberg farm." Adam's hands stilled again. "What do you mean, someone like you?" "Someone broken, someone cast out, someone who brings nothing but trouble." The words tasted bitter in her mouth, but they were the truth as she had learned to understand it. "You're not broken." His voice carried a certainty that surprised her. "Hurt, yes. Tired, definitely, but not broken. A broken person doesn't fight through a blizzard. A broken person doesn't offer to work for their keep instead of begging for handouts." Sandra looked at him then, really looked at him. He was handsome in a rugged way, with strong features and eyes that seemed to see more than they revealed. There was something solid about him, something dependable. But there was also something guarded, as if he too had learned to protect himself from the world's cruelties. She said, Adam replied. Quote 42. His pragmatic approach to marriage was both refreshing and terrifying. Sandra had grown up hearing stories of grand romance, of love that conquered all obstacles. But she had also seen the reality of marriages built on convenience, on economic necessity, on simple human need for companionship. Perhaps Adam's honest assessment was more realistic than the fairy tales. "What would you expect from me?" she asked. "As a wife, I mean." "Partnership, loyalty, honesty, the same things I would offer you." Adam set down his carving and leaned forward slightly. "This isn't a prison, Sandra. I'm not looking for a servant or a possession. I'm looking for someone to share this life with, someone who can handle the isolation and the challenges that come with living apart from civilization." Sandra's name sounded strange in his mouth, unfamiliar but not unpleasant. She realized he must have gone through her few possessions while she was unconscious, found some identification. The thought should have bothered her, but somehow it didn't. "And if I say no, then you rest until you're strong. I give you supplies and directions to the nearest town, and you go your own way. No judgment, no hard feelings." The offer was more generous than anything she had received in months. But it also terrified her because it meant making a choice about her future, about what kind of life she wanted to build from the ashes of what she had lost. "I need time to think," she said. Adam nodded. "Take all the time you need, but understand that winter is settling in hard. If you're going to leave, it should be soon. After the next storm, the passes will be closed until spring." The implication was clear. If she stayed much longer, she would be staying until spring, regardless of her decision about marriage. The mountain itself would make the choice for her. That night, Sandra lay awake listening to the wind howl around the cabin and the steady breathing of the man who had offered her a new life. The fire had burned down to embers, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She thought about the people who had cast her out, about the life she had left behind, about the uncertain future that stretched ahead of her. She had been born into poverty, the daughter of a woman who had died young and a father who had disappeared before her first birthday. She had been passed from relative to relative, each one viewing her as a burden to be endured rather than a child to be cherished. She had learned early that her value was measured only in what she could contribute, what work she could do, what problems she could solve for others. The beating that had preceded her exile had come after she had dared to suggest that she deserved better treatment, that her years of unpaid labor had earned her at least basic human dignity. Her uncle's response had been swift and brutal, his fist teaching her the lesson that people like her had no right to expect fairness or kindness from the world. But Adam Gonzalez was offering her something different. Not charity, not pity, but partnership. The idea was so foreign to her experience that she struggled to believe it was real. The next morning dawned clear and cold, the storm having blown itself out during the night. Sandra woke to the smell of coffee and bacon, her stomach growling in response. She found Adam at the stove, cooking breakfast with the same methodical precision he brought to everything else. He asked without turning around. Quote 52. It was true, the rest and warmth had worked wonders on her battered body. The bruises on her face were fading, and the cuts on her feet had begun to heal. Quote 53. Sandra accepted the plate he handed her, surprised by the quality of the meal. The bacon was perfectly cooked, the eggs fresh, the coffee strong and black. Quote, the casual reference to quote 56 was not lost on her. Adam was already thinking of them as a unit, a partnership. The assumption should have annoyed her, but instead it filled her with a strange warmth. After breakfast, he led her outside into the brilliant mountain morning. The world was transformed by the fresh snow, every tree and rock sculpted into fantastic shapes by the wind. The air was so clean and cold it hurt to breathe, but it was also invigorating in a way that made Sandra feel more alive than she had in months. The cabin sat in a natural clearing surrounded by towering pines. Behind it, a barn housed the chickens Adam had mentioned, along with a single horse, a sturdy bay mare who watched them with intelligent eyes. To one side, a workshop contained tools for woodworking, metalsmithing, and other crafts. Everything was neat, organized, functional, quote 57, Adam said with quiet pride. Quote 58. Sandra could see the care that had gone into every structure, every detail. This was not the rough shelter of a man hiding from civilization, but the carefully planned homestead of someone who had chosen this life deliberately. Quote 59, she said, and meant it. Quote 60, and Adam replied. Quote 16, Sandra thought about the crowded, hostile environment she had left behind, where privacy was a luxury and solitude was impossible. Adam glanced at her with something that might have been approval. Quote Chandler. They walked to the edge of the clearing where the ground dropped away in a steep slope that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. The vista was breathtaking, an endless expanse of snow-covered peaks and dark forests stretching to the horizon. Sandra had never seen anything so vast, so untouched by human interference. She asked. Adam was quiet for so long that Sandra thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain. Quote, Sandra understood that need all too well. She had felt it herself in the moments before her exile, the desperate desire to become someone other than the victim she had always been. Quote 67, she asked. Quote 60, me. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the play of light and shadow across the distant peaks. Sandra found herself imagining what it would be like to wake up to this view every morning, to share the changing seasons with someone who understood the value of solitude and the necessity of partnership. She asked. Adam's tone was matter-of-fact, but Sandra heard the loneliness beneath it. What about yours? Gone. One way or another, they're all gone. Sandra didn't elaborate, and Adam didn't press. They both understood that some stories were too painful to tell to someone who was still essentially a stranger. They spent the rest of the morning exploring the property. Adam showed her the root cellar where he stored vegetables and preserved meat, the smokehouse where he cured bacon and ham, the spring house that provided fresh water year-round. Everything was designed for self-sufficiency, for survival without dependence on the outside world. "You really don't need help," Sandra observed. "You've got everything organized perfectly." "I've had 15 years to get it right," Adam replied. "But efficiency isn't the same as fulfillment. A man can survive alone, but that's not the same as living." After lunch, Sandra found herself helping Adam with small tasks around the homestead. She gathered eggs from the chickens, helped him split wood for the fire, assisted with minor repairs to the barn door. The work felt good, purposeful in a way that her previous labor had never been. Here, she was contributing to something that belonged to her as much as to him, assuming she chose to stay. As the afternoon wore on, Sandra became increasingly aware of Adam watching her. Not in a predatory way, but with the careful attention of someone trying to assess whether she would be a good fit for this life. She found herself doing the same, observing how he moved, how he spoke, how he treated the animals and the land around him. He was gentle with the chickens, patient with the horse, respectful of the environment that sustained him. When he spoke to Sandra, his tone was always courteous, never condescending or dismissive. He listened when she spoke, considered her suggestions, treated her opinions as valuable, even though they barely knew each other. It was a revelation to be treated as an equal, as someone whose thoughts and feelings mattered. Sandra had grown so accustomed to being dismissed, ignored, or actively mistreated that Adam's basic human decency felt like a gift. As evening approached, they sat by the fire again, the comfortable routine already feeling familiar. Adam returned to his carving while Sandra mended a tear in one of his shirts. The domestic scene felt surreal given that they had met only 3 days ago, but also surprisingly natural. Quote 78, Sandra asked, nodding toward the piece of wood in his hands. Quote 17, Adam held up the partially completed figure, its form already recognizable despite the rough state. Quote 80, the image of this solitary mountain man carving toys for children he rarely saw touched something deep in Sandra's heart. It spoke to a gentleness, a connection to humanity that his isolated lifestyle might have been expected to erode. "Do you want children?" she asked, the question slipping out before she could stop herself. Adam's hands stilled. He looked at her directly. Sandra had never allowed herself to seriously consider the possibility. Children required stability, security, love, all things that had been absent from her own life. But sitting in this warm cabin, watching this good man create something beautiful with his hands, the idea didn't seem as impossible as it once had. "I think so," she said honestly. "I never thought I'd have the chance, but yes, I think I'd like that." The conversation drifted to other topics, but Sandra found her mind returning to the question of children, of building a family with this man she barely knew but was beginning to respect deeply. The idea was both thrilling and terrifying, representing a future so different from anything she had imagined that it felt like stepping into someone else's life. That night, as she lay in her makeshift bed by the fire, Sandra made her decision. She had spent her entire life at the mercy of other people's choices, accepting whatever scraps of kindness or cruelty they chose to offer. Adam Gonzalez was offering her something unprecedented, the chance to choose her own future, to become a partner rather than a dependent. The next morning she told him, "I'll stay," she said as they shared breakfast. "I'll marry you." Adam nodded as if he had expected this answer, but Sandra caught the flash of relief in his eyes. "Good, we can ride down to town next week, find a preacher, get it done properly." Just like that? Sandra had expected more discussion, more negotiation of terms. "Just like that, unless you want to change your mind?" No, I don't want to change my mind." Sandra surprised herself with the certainty in her voice. "But I want you to know that I'm not coming to this as an innocent. I've seen the worst of what people can do to each other. I've been hurt, badly, more than once. I'm not sure I know how to trust completely." Adam set down his coffee cup and looked at her with those penetrating, gray eyes. "I'm not asking you to trust blindly. Trust is earned, and I intend to earn yours. But I am asking you to give us both a chance to build something good together. And if it doesn't work, if we find we're not compatible, then we deal with that when it happens. But I don't think it will come to that. we're both practical people who understand that marriage is work, not just feeling. As long as we're both willing to put in the effort, we can make this succeed." His confidence was reassuring, even if Sandra didn't entirely share it. She had seen too many marriages fail, too many partnerships dissolve into bitterness and recrimination. But she had also never seen a marriage begin with such honest acknowledgement of the challenges ahead. The week that followed was a strange period of adjustment as they prepared for their journey to town and their new life together. Sandra helped Adam with the daily chores, learning the rhythms of mountain life. She discovered that she had a talent for working with the chickens, who seemed to respond to her gentle approach. The horse, initially suspicious, gradually accepted her presence and even began to seek out her attention. Adam, for his part, seemed to be studying her as much as she was studying him. Sandra caught him watching her as she worked, not with suspicion or calculation, but with the careful attention of someone trying to understand a puzzle. She supposed she was doing the same thing, trying to reconcile the man she was coming to know with the hermit of local legend. The reality was far more complex than the story suggested. Adam was indeed solitary by nature, comfortable with silence in his own company in ways that spoke of deep self-knowledge. But he was also surprisingly social when the situation called for it, engaging Sandra in conversations that revealed both intelligence and curiosity about the world beyond his mountain. He had been educated, she learned, before the war changed his trajectory. He read voraciously, ordering books through the general store in town and having them delivered with his other supplies. His cabin contained a small but well-chosen library that covered everything from practical manuals to poetry to philosophy. Quote, 96, he told her one evening as they discussed a book they had both read. Quote, 97, Sandra found herself falling into easy conversation with him, sharing thoughts and opinions she had never felt safe expressing before. Adam listened without judgment, challenged her ideas without dismissing them, treated her intellect as something valuable rather than threatening. It was a heady experience for someone who had been told repeatedly that her thoughts and feelings were worthless. The night before their departure for town, Sandra lay awake thinking about the magnitude of the step she was about to take. In less than 24 hours, she would be married to a man she had known for barely 2 weeks. By any conventional standard, it was madness. But conventional standards had never served her well. Conventional wisdom said she should be grateful for any shelter, any protection, any scraps of affection thrown her way. Conventional morality said she should accept her place at the bottom of society's hierarchy and make the best of it. Adam Gonzalez was offering her something unconventional: equality, partnership, respect. The chance to build a life based on mutual benefit rather than charity or exploitation. The morning dawned clear and cold, perfect weather for the ride to town. Adam had packed supplies for the journey, including a warm coat for Sandra that he had somehow procured during one of his previous trips. It fit her perfectly, suggesting that he had been planning for this possibility longer than he had let on. The horse, whose name Sandra learned was Betty, proved to be as steady and reliable as her owner. She carried them down the mountain trail with sure-footed confidence, navigating the treacherous path as if it were a city street. The journey took most of the day, winding through spectacular scenery that took Sandra's breath away. She had never been this high in the mountains, never seen views that stretched for hundreds of miles in every direction. The world below seemed small and insignificant from this perspective, its problems and conflicts reduced to ant-like proportions. Quote 98, Adam observed, following her gaze across the vast landscape. At 99, quote 100, quote 101. Sandra smiled at the small joke, one of the few attempts at humor she had heard from him. It occurred to her that she was probably seeing a side of Adam that few people ever witnessed, the man beneath the stoic exterior. The town, when they finally reached it, was smaller than Sandra had expected. A collection of wooden buildings clustered around a single main street. It looked like a place where everyone knew everyone else's business and strangers were noticed immediately. Sandra felt the weight of curious stares as they rode down the street toward the church. "Don't mind them," Adam said quietly. "They're not used to seeing me with company. The gossip will die down soon enough." The preacher, a thin man with kind eyes and a gentle manner, seemed unsurprised by their request. Sandra suspected that Adam had sent word ahead, preparing for this moment. The ceremony itself was brief and simple, conducted in the small church with only the preacher's wife as witness. Sandra's voice caught slightly as she answered, "I do." The words felt momentous, final in a way that surprised her. She was no longer Sandra Anderson, the unwanted burden, the victim of other people's cruelty. She was Sandra Gonzalez, partner to a man who had chosen her, who had offered her a place in his life as an equal. Adam's kiss was brief and chaste, appropriate for the setting and their still developing relationship. But there was warmth in it, a promise of deeper intimacy to come when they were both ready. They spent the night in the town's small inn, in separate rooms at Sandra's request. She needed time to adjust to her new status, to process the reality of what she had just done. Adam seemed to understand, making no demands or assumptions about their wedding night. "We have the rest of our lives to figure things out," he told her as they parted ways in the inn's hallway. Quote 109. His patience and understanding only reinforced Sandra's growing conviction that she had made the right choice. This was a man who respected her boundaries, who understood that trust and intimacy could not be forced or hurried. The next morning brought an unexpected complication. As they prepared to leave town, a group of riders approached the inn. Sandra recognized them immediately and felt her blood turn to ice. Her uncle, Larry Cruz, and two of his friends had somehow tracked her down. "Sandra!" Larry's voice boomed across the street. Quote 111. The lie was delivered with such conviction that Sandra almost believed it herself. Larry had always been skilled at presenting himself as the concerned guardian when it suited his purposes. Adam stepped slightly in front of Sandra, his body language shifting subtly into something more protective. Quote 103, Larry replied with false joviality. Quote 114, quote 115, Sandra said, finding her voice despite the fear that threatened to overwhelm her. Quote 1. Larry's expression darkened. "Now, Sandra, you know that's not true. You're not thinking clearly. You've been through a trauma, and you need to come home where your family can take care of you." "The trauma was what you did to me," Sandra replied, her voice growing stronger. "The beating, the humiliation, throwing me out in a blizzard. I remember it all very clearly." "That's not how it happened," Larry said, but his eyes shifted nervously. "You're confused, girl. Probably hit your head when you wandered off. This gentleman here has been filling your mind with nonsense." Adam's voice, when he spoke, was deadly quiet. Quote 22. The word wife hit Larry like a physical blow. His face went through several color changes as he processed this information. Quote 3. Quote where is Adam replied calmly. Quote one us, Larry snarled, dropping his pretense of concern. Quote quote, and Adam said, his hand moving casually to rest on the grip of the gun at his hip. Quote 1 is, the two other riders shifted uncomfortably, clearly not eager for a confrontation with the mountain man whose reputation had preceded him even to their distant community. Larry, however, seemed determined to press his claim. He insisted. Adam replied. Larry laughed harshly. Quote 35. The casual cruelty of the words hit Sandra like a physical blow, but they also crystallized something inside her. She stepped out from behind Adam, facing her uncle directly. Quote 136, she said quietly. Quote 137. Larry's face twisted with rage. You ungrateful little... That's enough. Adam's voice cut through Larry's tirade like a blade. You've said your piece. Now you can leave. All of you. This isn't over, Larry snarled. Family is family. She belongs to us. She belongs to herself, Adam replied. And to me, by choice and by law. If I see any of you on my property, I'll consider it trespassing and act accordingly. The threat was delivered with such calm certainty that even Larry seemed to recognize its seriousness. After a long moment of tense silence, he wheeled his horse around and rode off with his companions, but not before shooting Sandra a look of pure venom. He'll be back, Sandra said quietly as the riders disappeared down the street. Maybe, Adam agreed, but not today. And when he does come back, he'll find that you're not alone anymore. The simple statement carried a weight of promise that made Sandra's eyes fill with tears. For the first time in her life, someone was willing to stand with her, to protect her not out of duty or obligation, but out of choice. The ride back to the mountain was subdued, both of them lost in their own thoughts about the confrontation they had just experienced. Sandra found herself reliving every word, every gesture, analyzing the encounter for clues about what might come next. Larry was not a man who accepted defeat gracefully, and his parting words had carried the weight of a threat. Quote 148, Adam said as they climbed higher into the mountains. Quote Waterdu, Sandra considered the question carefully. Quote 50, quote Wassernaun, quote Frontu. Sandra glanced at Adam, noting the thoughtful expression on his face. Quote Adam was quiet for a long moment before answering. Quote Wanderson. The certainty in his voice was both comforting and humbling. Sandra had never had anyone willing to share her burdens, to stand with her against the forces that sought to drag her down. The reality of partnership was still so foreign to her experience that she struggled to believe it was real. They reached the cabin as the sun was setting, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. The sight of home, for that was what it already felt like, filled Sandra with a peace she had never experienced. Here, in this isolated sanctuary, she could begin to build the life she had never dared to dream of. That evening, as they shared dinner by the fire, Sandra found herself studying her new husband with fresh eyes. The confrontation with Larry had revealed aspects of Adam's character that their quiet courtship had only hinted at. He was protective without being possessive, strong without being domineering, confident without being arrogant. Thank you, she said suddenly, for what you did today, for standing up to them. You don't need to thank me for that, Adam replied. It's what any decent man would do for his wife. No, Sandra said firmly, it's not. Most men would have handed me over to avoid the trouble, or they would have used it as an excuse to get rid of me later. What you did today was extraordinary, even if you don't see it that way. Adam set down his fork and looked at her seriously. Sandra, I want you to understand something. When I asked you to marry me, I wasn't looking for a convenience or a temporary arrangement. I was looking for a partner, someone to build a life with. That means I'm committed to you and to us, whatever challenges we might face. The words were spoken simply, without drama or grand gestures, but they carried more weight than any flowery declaration of love. This was a man who understood commitment, who took his promises seriously. I'm committed too, Sandra said. I know I don't have much to offer, but what I have is yours. You have more to offer than you realize, Adam replied. Strength, courage, intelligence, determination. Those are rare qualities, and they're exactly what this life requires. That night, Sandra lay in her bed by the fire and thought about the strange turn her life had taken. A month ago, she had been a victim, powerless and alone. Now she was a wife, a partner, someone with a stake in her own future. The transformation was so complete that she sometimes felt like she was living someone else's life. But it was her life chosen freely and built on a foundation of mutual respect and shared purpose. For the first time since childhood, Sandra allowed herself to hope for the future, to imagine what tomorrow might bring instead of simply trying to survive until the next day. The weeks that followed their return from town settled into a comfortable routine. Sandra threw herself into learning everything she could about mountain life, from preserving food to predicting weather to managing the small flock of chickens that had become her particular responsibility. Adam proved to be a patient teacher, explaining not just what to do, but why it mattered, helping her understand the interconnected systems that made their isolated life possible. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire and talk about everything and nothing. Adam shared stories of his life before the mountain, his experiences in the war, his journey toward the peace he had found in solitude. Sandra, more hesitantly, began to open up about her own past, the series of rejections and betrayals that had shaped her understanding of the world. Quote 168, she admitted one night as they watched the flames dance in the fireplace. Quote, and quote, Wafsi, Adam and Virginia, quote, Ron. These conversations, Sandra realized, were building something between them that went deeper than the practical partnership they had initially agreed to. Trust was growing, slowly but steadily, nurtured by small acts of consideration and understanding. Adam never pushed for more intimacy than she was ready to give, never made demands or assumptions about her feelings or desires. Instead, he simply lived his life with integrity and invited her to be part of it. The invitation was always open, never forced, allowing Sandra to move at her own pace toward whatever their relationship might become. One morning in early December, Sandra woke to find Adam standing at the window with a grim expression on his face. Quote 172, she asked, joining him at the glass. Below them, in the clearing that surrounded their cabin, she could see tracks in the fresh snow. Not animal tracks, but the boot prints of several men who had circled their home during the night. Sandra asked, her heart beginning to race. Quote 174. Sandra's blood ran cold. Larry. Most likely. The question is whether this was just reconnaissance or a warning. Adam moved away from the window and began checking his weapons, a rifle and 2 pistols that he maintained with the same meticulous care he brought to everything else. His movements were calm and methodical, but Sandra could see the tension in his shoulders. What do we do? She asked. We prepare, and we wait. If they wanted a direct confrontation, they would have come to the door. This is psychological warfare trying to make us nervous, make us make mistakes. Are you nervous? Adam paused in his preparations and looked at her directly. I'm concerned, but I'm not afraid. We're in a strong position here, and we have supplies to last the winter. They, on the other hand, are operating far from their base in weather and terrain that favor us. His confidence was reassuring, but Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Larry was not a man who gave up easily, especially when his pride was involved. The fact that he had tracked them to their mountain sanctuary and taken the risk of approaching their home meant he was serious about reclaiming what he saw as his property. The next few days passed in tense anticipation. Adam increased his patrols around the property, checking for signs of intrusion or surveillance. He taught Sandra how to use the rifle, showing her how to load, aim, and fire accurately. The lessons were practical and matter-of-fact, but they underscored the seriousness of their situation. Sandra said after a particularly intensive practice session, quote 182. Adam replied, quote 183. Sandra understood the logic, but the weight of the rifle in her hands felt strange and foreign. She had spent her entire life as a victim, someone things were done to rather than someone who acted decisively in her own defense. The idea of being able to protect herself and her home was both empowering and terrifying. On the 3rd night after the tracks appeared, they came. Sandra woke to the sound of Adam moving quietly through the cabin, checking the windows and doors. He whispered. Sandra's mouth went dry. What do they want? You, but they're not going to get you. Adam positioned himself at the front window while Sandra took the back. Through the glass, she could see shadowy figures moving between the trees, trying to stay hidden but visible enough in the moonlight to be spotted by anyone watching carefully. Sandra! Larry's voice boomed across the clearing. Kuda 189. Quote 192. Sandra called back, surprising herself with the vehemence in her voice. Quote 101. Larry replied, his tone carrying false hurt. Quote Sandra shouted. Quote 185. Adam's voice cut through the night like a blade. The only confusion here is yours, Cruz. This is my property, and you're trespassing. I suggest you leave while you still can. Your property? Larry laughed harshly. You think you can steal a man's kin and hide behind property lines? That girl belongs to me. I raised her, fed her, clothed her. She owes me. She owes you nothing, Adam replied. And she's not a girl anymore. She's a woman, my wife. And she's made her choice. Respect it and leave. I don't think so, Larry said. See, I've been thinking about this situation, and I've come to the conclusion that you've bewitched her somehow, taken advantage of her weakened state to trick her into this so-called marriage. That makes it invalid, which means she's coming home with me. Sandra felt a surge of rage at the casual dismissal of her agency, her right to make her own decisions. I wasn't bewitched or tricked, she called out. I chose to marry Adam because he's a good man who treats me with respect. Something you never learned how to do. Respect? Larry's voice turned ugly. Quote 206. Quote 27. Sandra replied. Quote 200. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of breaking glass as one of Larry's companions threw a rock through one of the cabin's side windows. The message was clear. Talk time was over, Larry called. Adam said quietly, but his voice carried clearly across the clearing. Quote 21 and 2 quote. For a long moment, as silence stretched between the cabin and the trees, Sandra could feel the tension building like the pressure before a storm. Then Larry's voice rang out again, filled with venom. "Have it your way. Boys, burn them out." Sandra saw the flicker of flames through the trees as torches were lit. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she realized they intended to set fire to the cabin, to destroy everything she and Adam had built together. "The workshop," Adam said urgently. "They'll try to fire the workshop first, cut off our escape route to the barn." He was right. Sandra could see figures moving toward the wooden building that housed Adam's tools and equipment. If they succeeded in burning it, the flames could easily spread to the cabin itself. "Quote to once idol," Sandra said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "Quote 217. She moved toward the back door, rifle in hand, but Adam caught her in her arm. "Quote 2-eyed, he said. "Quote 29. They slipped out of the cabin into the cold night air, moving as quietly as possible toward the workshop. Sandra could see two men approaching the building with torches, their attention focused on their destructive mission rather than watching for defenders. "Quote on," Adam whispered. They stepped out of the shadows simultaneously, weapons raised. Adam commanded. "Quote 2. The two men spun around, startled by the unexpected confrontation. One of them, a burly man Sandra didn't recognize, reached for the gun at his hip. Adam's rifle spoke first, the shot echoing across the clearing like thunder. The man cried out and fell, clutching his shoulder. The second man dropped his torch and raised his hands. "Quote, Natum said. Quote, before the man could respond, gunfire erupted from the trees as Larry and his remaining companions opened fire on the cabin and workshop. Sandra and Adam dove for cover behind a pile of cut wood and as bullets whined overhead. Adam muttered. Sandra peered around the edge of their cover and saw muzzle flashes from at least 4 different positions. Larry had positioned his men in a rough circle around the buildings, trying to pin them down, while others moved in for the kill. Adam said, quote 229, quote 230. Sandra nodded toward the wounded man, who was trying to crawl away from the firefight. Quote 231. They made a run for the cabin, zigzagging through the snow as bullets kicked up puffs of white around their feet. Sandra felt a strange calm descend over her as they ran, as if her fear had transformed into something harder and more focused. These men had come to destroy her home, to drag her back to a life of abuse and degradation. She would not let that happen. They reached the cabin safely and took up positions at the windows. Adam had been right about the defensive advantages. The thick log walls would stop most bullets, and they had clear fields of fire in all directions. "Quote 232, Sandra asked. Quote 30, Adam replied grimly. Quote 23. As if to prove his point, the gunfire from the trees began to slacken. Sandra could hear voices calling back and forth, Larry's among them, as the attackers tried to coordinate their next move. They're going to try to rush us, Adam predicted, probably from 2 directions at once, hoping to overwhelm our ability to respond. Sandra checked her rifle, making sure it was loaded and ready. The weapon felt more natural in her hands now, less like a foreign object and more like a tool she could use to protect what mattered to her. "Sandra," Larry's voice called from the darkness. "10 to 38. Quota 39, Sandra shouted back, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. Quota 41, the attack, when it came, was swift and coordinated. 3 men rushed the front of the cabin, while 2 more approached from the rear. Adam and Sandra split their attention between the 2 groups, firing as quickly and accurately as they could. Sandra's first shot took down one of the men approaching the back window. Her second missed, but Adam's rifle spoke from the front room, and she heard a cry of pain from that direction. The remaining attackers reached the cabin walls and began trying to break down the doors and windows. Sandra could hear them pounding against the heavy wooden barriers that Adam had built to withstand exactly this kind of assault. Adam called. Quote 242. Sandra positioned herself where she could cover the door while still watching the back approaches. Her heart was pounding, but her hands were steady as she aimed the rifle at the entrance. The door burst open with a crash of splintering wood. 2 men rushed through, guns drawn, but Sandra was ready for them. Her shot caught the first man's center mass, dropping him instantly. The second man spun toward her, raising his weapon, but Adam's pistol barked from across the room, and the man crumpled. Suddenly, the cabin was quiet except for the sound of their own breathing and the moaning of the wounded man outside. Sandra waited, rifle ready, but no more attackers appeared. "Larry," Adam called, "you still out there?" No answer came from the darkness. "I think they're gone," Sandra whispered. "Maybe, or maybe they're regrouping." Adam moved carefully to the broken window and peered out into the night. "I see tracks heading back toward the trees. Looks like they've had enough for tonight." Sandra slumped against the wall, suddenly exhausted. The adrenaline that had carried her through the fight was ebbing, leaving her shaky and drained. "Is it over?" "For now, but they'll be back. Men like Larry don't give up easy, especially when they have been humiliated." Sandra looked around at the damage to their home. The front door hung in splinters. One window was completely shattered, and bullet holes pocked the walls. But they were alive, and they had successfully defended their sanctuary. "We did it," she said wonderingly. "We actually fought them off." "You did it," Adam corrected. "You could have hidden, could have let me handle everything. Instead, you stood and fought for our home, for our life together. I'm proud of you." The simple words of praise meant more to Sandra than any grand declaration could have. She had spent her entire life being told she was worthless, incapable, a burden to be endured. Tonight, she had proven to herself and to Adam that she was none of those things. The next morning brought a grisly discovery. The man Sandra had shot in the back was dead, frozen in the snow where he had fallen. The wounded man from the workshop was gone, presumably helped away by his surviving companions. Blood trails in the snow told the story of their retreat. "We need to bury him," Sandra said, looking down at the dead man. "We will. But first we need to secure the cabin. They'll be back, and next time they'll be better prepared." They spent the day reinforcing their defenses, boarding up the broken windows with heavy planks, installing new bars on the doors, and creating firing positions that would give them better coverage of the approaches to the cabin. As they worked, Sandra found herself thinking about the man she had killed. She felt no guilt about defending her home and her husband, but the reality of taking a life was sobering. She had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, had become someone capable of deadly violence when necessary. "Does it get easier?" she asked Adam as they dragged the dead man's body to a gravesite behind the cabin. "Quote 257. Adam replied honestly, quote 257. That evening, as they sat by the fire in their damaged but still functional home, Sandra reflected on how much her life had changed. 6 months ago, she had been a victim, powerless and afraid. Now she was a woman who had killed to defend her home, who had stood beside her husband in battle and proven herself worthy of the partnership he had offered. Quote 259. She asked, quote Chow, quote Dahondis, and Adam was quiet for a moment, staring into the flames. Quote Chow. Sandra nodded, feeling a deep sense of peace despite the uncertainty that lay ahead. She had found something worth fighting for, worth defending with her life if necessary. For the first time in her existence, she truly belonged somewhere, was valued and respected, and loved. The word love surprised her as it formed in her mind. When had that happened? When had the practical partnership she had agreed to become something deeper and more meaningful? Looking at Adam's profile in the firelight, seeing the strength and determination and kindness that defined him, Sandra realized that love had been growing quietly between them for weeks. Built on respect and shared hardship and mutual support, it was a different kind of love than the passionate romance of stories, but it was no less real or powerful for being practical. "Adam," she said softly. He turned to look at her, and she saw her own feelings reflected in his eyes. "I love you," she said simply. "I love you too," he replied, and leaned over to kiss her properly for the first time since their wedding day. The kiss was gentle but full of promise, a seal on the bond that had been forming between them since the night she had stumbled to his door, half dead from cold and despair. When they parted, Sandra felt as if something fundamental had shifted in her understanding of herself and her place in the world. "I never thought I'd be able to say those words and mean them," she admitted. "I never thought anyone would want to hear them from me." "You're not the same person who came to my door that night," Adam said. "And neither am I. We've both become something more than we were alone." The truth of his words resonated deeply with Sandra. She had indeed become someone new, someone stronger and more complete than the broken woman who had begged for the chance to work for her survival. The transformation had been gradual, built through small acts of kindness and respect and shared purpose. But it was no less profound for being subtle. That night, they made love for the first time, a gentle and tender joining that spoke of deep affection rather than mere passion. Sandra had never experienced physical intimacy as an expression of love rather than dominance or a transaction, and the difference was revelatory. Afterward, as they lay entwined before the fire, Sandra felt a completeness she had never imagined possible. She was no longer alone, no longer fighting the world by herself. She had found her place, her purpose, her person. The peaceful interlude lasted 3 days. On the fourth morning, Adam spotted smoke rising from the valley below. Too much smoke to be explained by normal activities. "They're burning the Johnson place," he said grimly, lowering his spyglass. Sandra knew the Johnsons, an elderly couple who lived about 10 miles down the mountain. They had been kind to her during her brief visit to town, offering warm words and a genuine welcome that had meant more than they could have known. "Are they?" Sandra couldn't finish the question. Quote 272. Adam didn't finish the sentence either. The implication was clear. Larry was escalating his campaign, targeting anyone who might be sympathetic to Sandra or willing to help them. The Johnsons were guilty of nothing more than treating her like a human being, but that was apparently crime enough in Larry's twisted worldview. Quote 273, Sandra said. Quote 274, Adam replied sadly. Quote 275, Sandra felt a cold fury building in her chest, bad enough that Larry had spent years making her life miserable, had beaten her and cast her out to die. But to hurt innocent people, to destroy the lives of those who had shown her kindness, was unforgivable. She asked. Adam spent the rest of the day making preparations. He cleaned and loaded every weapon in the cabin, checked their ammunition supplies, and studied maps of the surrounding area. His movements were methodical and purposeful, those of a man preparing for war. Quote 278, Sandra said as she watched him work. Quote 279, Adam looked at her as if she had suggested he cut off his own arm. Quote 280, the certainty in his voice was both comforting and terrifying. Sandra had never had anyone willing to fight for her, to put themselves at risk for her sake. The reality of being truly valued, truly protected, was still overwhelming. That evening, as they made their final preparations, Sandra found herself thinking about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The scared, beaten girl who had begged for the chance to work was gone, replaced by someone who was ready to fight for her home and her happiness. Quote 281, she said suddenly, surprising herself with the realization. Quote 282, Adam agreed. Quote 2. The attack came at dawn, just as Adam had predicted. But this time, Larry had brought a small army. Sandra counted at least a dozen men surrounding their cabin, all armed and positioned for a coordinated assault. Quote 284. Larry's voice boomed across the clearing. This is your last chance. Come out now, and I'll let your mountain man live. I'm not coming out, Sandra called back. This is my home, and you're not welcome here. Then you've chosen to die with him. So be it. The assault began immediately, with gunfire erupting from multiple positions around the cabin. But Adam had spent the previous day well, and their improved defenses held against the initial barrage. They're trying to pin us down while others move in close, Adam observed, firing carefully aimed shots at the muzzle flashes in the trees. Same tactic as before, but with more men. Sandra took her position at the rear window, watching for flanking movements. She could see shapes moving through the trees, trying to work their way around to the blind spots in their defenses. 2 men coming up the back slope, she reported. Take them. Sandra's rifle spoke twice and both figures dropped. The months of practice had made her a competent marksman, and the knowledge that she was defending her home gave her shots deadly accuracy. The battle raged for what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes. Sandra lost count of how many shots she fired, how many targets she engaged. The world narrowed to the simple mechanics of loading, aiming, and firing, of protecting the life she had built with the man she loved. Then suddenly the gunfire stopped. Quote 293. Larry's voice called from the trees. I've got something that belongs to you. Sandra's blood ran cold as she saw Larry emerge from the tree line, dragging a struggling figure with him. It was Betty, the elderly woman from town who had been kind to Sandra during their visit. Larry held a knife to her throat, using her as a human shield. Quote 295, Adam called. Quote, Larry snarled. Quote 28. Sandra felt sick as she realized that Larry's campaign of terror was expanding to include anyone who had helped them, anyone who had shown them kindness or support. What do you want? Adam asked. I want Sandra, out here unarmed, in exchange for the old woman's life. Simple trade. Sandra was already moving toward the door when Adam caught her arm. No, it's a trap. He'll kill you both. I can't let her die because of me, Sandra said. She's innocent. So are you, and if you go out there, everything we've fought for dies with you. Sandra stared at Adam, torn between her desire to save an innocent woman and her understanding that surrendering would accomplish nothing. Larry was not a man who kept his word, not someone who could be trusted to honor any agreement. There has to be another way, she said desperately. Adam's eyes were hard as flint. 306. Before Sandra could ask what he meant, Adam was moving toward the front door. Quote 307. He called. Quote through and quote burn. Sandra cried, but he was already opening the door. Quote 310. He commanded. Quote to even. Sandra watched in horror as Adam stepped out into the clearing, his hands raised but his rifle still in his grasp. Larry's men immediately trained their weapons on him, but Larry himself seemed intrigued by this development. Well, Larry said, pressing the knife closer to Betty's throat. Quote 339, quote Fernan, Adam said calmly. Quote Frada, quote Prince. Larry laughed harshly. Quote vanish, quote Farnham. Adam replied, quote 319, quote 320. Sandra realized with growing horror that this had never really been about her. It was about Larry's ego, his need to demonstrate his power over those he considered beneath him. She was just a symbol in his twisted worldview, a piece of property whose escape threatened his self-image. Then you and I have a problem, Adam said quietly. Yes, we do, but I'm willing to solve it simply. You put down that rifle and I'll make this quick for both of you. Keep fighting and I'll make sure you both suffer before you die. Adam's response was to raise his rifle and fire in one smooth motion. The shot took Larry in the shoulder, spinning him around and causing him to release his grip on Betty. The old woman immediately dropped to the ground and began crawling toward the cabin. The clearing erupted in gunfire as Larry's men opened up on Adam. Sandra watched in horror as her husband dove for cover behind a pile of firewood, bullets kicking up snow all around him. Sandra couldn't stand it anymore. Despite Adam's orders, she grabbed her rifle and burst out of the cabin, firing as she ran toward her wounded husband. Her first shot dropped one of Larry's men. Her second sent another diving for cover. Quote 323. Adam shouted as she slid into cover beside him. Quote 324. Sandra shouted back, working the bolt on her rifle. Despite the desperate circumstances, Adam smiled. Quote 325. They fought side by side, covering each other as they moved from position to position around the clearing. Sandra had never felt so alive, so purposeful, as she did in those moments of desperate combat. This was what she had been building toward, the final test of the strength and partnership she had found with Adam. Larry, wounded but not defeated, had taken cover behind a large tree and was directing his remaining men with vicious determination. He screamed. Quote 327. But his men were losing heart. They had expected an easy victory over a hermit and his broken wife, not a pitched battle against two determined defenders who knew the terrain and fought with the desperation of people protecting their home. One by one, Larry's men began to fall back, abandoning their positions and retreating toward the tree line. Soon, only Larry himself remained, clutching his wounded shoulder and glaring across the clearing with undisguised hatred. "This isn't over," he screamed. "I'll be back. I'll bring the law, bring the army if I have to. That girl belongs to me." "No," Sandra said, stepping out of cover with her rifle trained on her uncle's chest. Quote 331. Larry's face twisted with rage. "You ungrateful little—" His words were cut off as he reached for the pistol at his hip. Sandra's rifle spoke once, the shot echoing across the clearing like thunder. Larry Cruz fell backward into the snow and lay still. Sandra stared at the body of the man who had terrorized her for so many years, feeling nothing but relief. The nightmare was finally over. Adam moved to her side, checking to make sure Larry was truly dead. Quote 333, he said quietly. Sandra nodded, unable to speak past the emotion clogging her throat. She had faced her demons and emerged victorious, had proven to herself and to the world that she was no longer a victim. Betty, the elderly woman Larry had used as a shield, was helped to her feet by Adam. She was shaken but unharmed, grateful to be alive. She whispered to Sandra. Quote de Frachon, quote Jeffrey, Sandra assured her. Quote de Marchand. They spent the rest of the day dealing with the aftermath of the battle. The surviving members of Larry's gang had fled, leaving their dead behind. Sandra and Adam buried the bodies in a mass grave, saying a brief prayer over men who had chosen violence and paid the ultimate price for their choice. Betty stayed with them for several days, recovering from her ordeal and helping them repair the damage to their cabin. She brought news from town, stories of other families that Larry had terrorized in his search for Sandra. He was getting desperate, she explained. People were starting to stand up to him, refusing to help with his search. He knew his time was running out. And now it's over, Sandra said with satisfaction. Yes, Betty agreed. Now it's over. When Betty finally left to return to town, she carried with her the story of Sandra's transformation from victim to victor. Word spread quickly through the mountain communities about the woman who had stood up to her abuser and won, who had found love and partnership in the most unlikely circumstances. Sandra and Adam settled back into their quiet life, but with a new understanding of their strength and their bond. They had been tested in the crucible of violence and emerged stronger than ever. Spring came early that year, bringing with it new growth and new possibilities. Sandra planted a garden behind the cabin, nurturing vegetables and flowers with the same care she brought to her marriage. The work was satisfying in a way that her previous labor had never been, because it was her choice, her contribution to a life she had helped create. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Sandra reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Do you ever regret it? She asked Adam. Marrying me, I mean. All the trouble it brought. Adam took her hand in his, calloused fingers intertwining with hers. Never, you're the best thing that ever happened to me, Sandra. You brought life to this place, purpose to my existence. I was just surviving before you came. Now I'm living. Sandra smiled, feeling the truth of his words resonate in her heart. She had indeed brought life to this mountain sanctuary, just as it had brought healing to her wounded soul. I love you, she said, the words coming easily now. I love you too, Adam replied, and I always will. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Sandra thought about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. The journey from victim to survivor to victor had been long and difficult, marked by pain and struggle and moments of despair. But it had led her here, to this place of peace and love and partnership. She had found her home, her purpose, her person. She had discovered that she was capable of far more than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. The mountain wind whispered through the pine trees, carrying with it the promise of tomorrow and all the tomorrows that would follow. Sandra Gonzalez, wife and partner and survivor, listened to its song and smiled. She was exactly where she belonged.